Your faith was never supposed to be bulletproof. That tight feeling in your chest when you pray and the answer doesn't come, when you step out in obedience and everything around you starts falling apart, that feeling has a name. And it's older than you think. By the end of this, you'll understand why the moment Peter went under the waves was the single most important thing that could have happened to him and to you. Let's set the scene. Matthew 14, verse 22. Jesus has just fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. The disciples are buzzing. Momentum is high. And then Jesus does something strange. He makes them get in a boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the lake. He sends them straight into a storm. Sit with that for a second. Jesus knew the storm was coming. He has authority over wind and waves. He'll prove that in minutes. And he deliberately sent them into it. The God who loves you sometimes steers you directly into the thing you'd never choose for yourself. The disciples didn't volunteer for rough seas. They were told to go. By the 4th watch of the night, somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning, they've been fighting the wind for hours, arms burning, boat taking on water, and then a figure appears walking across the surface of the lake. They think it's a ghost. They scream. These are grown men, seasoned fishermen, and they're terrified. Jesus calls out through the wind, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." And Peter, impulsive, beautiful, reckless Peter, says something that nobody else in that boat had the courage to say. "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." One word comes back across the waves. Come. 12 men in the boat. 11. Stay seated. One throws his leg over the edge into a storm. In the dark, on open water. Whatever else you say about Peter, the man moved. He responded to the voice of Christ with his body, with action, with a step that made 0 sense to anyone watching. And, for a few steps, he walked. On water. A human being doing the impossible because his eyes were locked on Jesus. So what went wrong? Matthew 14, verse 30. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." The wind didn't just start blowing when Peter looked at it. The storm had been raging the entire time he was walking. The waves were there when he stepped out of the boat. The spray was hitting his face from the first step. The circumstances didn't change. His focus did. This is where most people extract a clean little Sunday school lesson. Keep your eyes on Jesus, don't look at the waves, and move on. But there's something deeper here. Something that mirrors the exact architecture of how your faith gets tested in real life. Peter didn't sink because the storm got worse. He sank because he became conscious of what he'd been walking through all along. You've experienced this. You step out in faith, a new calling, a hard conversation, a financial risk taken in obedience, and for a while, you're carried by the adrenaline of saying yes to God. The early days feel supernatural. Then reality sets in. You start counting the waves, the bills, the silence, the friends who think you've lost your mind, and suddenly the water that was holding you feels very, very thin. The storm was always part of the invitation. When Jesus said, "Come," he said across churning water through howling wind in pitch darkness. He didn't say, "Come, and I'll calm the sea first." He didn't say, "Come once conditions improve." The call included the chaos. Every single time God has called someone in Scripture, Abraham, Moses, Gideon, Mary, the calling came wrapped in circumstances that made obedience look foolish. But here's what most sermons skip entirely. Look at what Peter did when he sank. He didn't try to swim. He didn't flail toward the boat. He cried out 3 words, "Lord, save me." And Matthew 14, verse 31, says immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Immediately, the Greek word is eutheos. There was 0 delay between Peter's cry and Christ's hand. The sinking and the rescue were almost simultaneous. Peter's faith failed, and in that failure, he discovered something the 11 men still sitting in the boat never learned. The faithfulness of Christ doesn't depend on the consistency of your faith. The men in the boat played it safe. They saw the same Jesus, heard the same voice, watched the same impossible moment. They stayed dry, they stayed comfortable, and they stayed exactly where they were. Peter got wet, got scared, got rebuked, and got held by the hand of God. The failure taught him something that success never could. Think about your own prayer life for a moment. How many times have you cried out to God from a place of sinking, a marriage falling apart, a diagnosis you didn't expect, a season of doubt so thick you couldn't feel his presence at all. And in those moments, did you quote theology at yourself, or did you just scream for help? Peter's 3-word prayer is the most honest prayer in the New Testament. No formula, no King James cadence, just raw, desperate need, directed at the only one who could meet it. And Jesus didn't say, well, if you'd maintained proper focus, you wouldn't be in this situation. He reached out his hand. First came rescue, then came the gentle correction. You of little faith, why did you doubt? Notice the order. Rescue, then teaching. Grace, then growth. Jesus pulled Peter up before he addressed Peter's failure. If you've been drowning in guilt, convince God is waiting for you to fix your faith before he'll intervene. You've got the order backwards. He grabs your hand while you're still going under, and that phrase, you of little faith, it's easy to read as disappointment, a rebuke, but the Greek is oligopistos, and Jesus uses it with his closest followers, the ones he's actively shaping. He doesn't say you of no faith. Peter had faith, enough to ask, enough to step out, enough to walk, and even when that faith buckled, enough to cry out to the right person. Little faith still moved Peter onto the water. Little faith still reached for Christ. Little faith, it turns out, is enough, because the object of that faith is infinite. This reframes everything about how you measure your own spiritual life. You've probably graded yourself on the consistency of your faith, the strength of your belief, the absence of doubt, as if the goal were to walk on water without ever wobbling. But Peter's story suggests something radically different. The goal is to get out of the boat. The goal is to step toward Jesus even when, especially when, the math doesn't work. And when you sink, the goal is to call his name before you call anyone else's. James 1 verses 2 through 4 puts it plainly. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. The storm produces something. The sinking produces something. Even the fear produces something if you let it drive you toward Christ instead of away from him. Peter went on to become the rock on which Jesus built his church. The man who sank became the man who preached at Pentecost, and 3,000 people came to faith in a single day. The man who couldn't keep his eyes on Jesus in a storm later kept his eyes on Jesus through prison, persecution, and martyrdom. The sinking was training. Every wave that hit his face, every second of going under, every desperate gasp, it was all building the kind of faith that doesn't need calm seas to stand. You might be in a sinking season right now. The water's up to your chest and you can't feel the bottom. You stepped out in obedience, and the storm got worse, and you're wondering if you heard God wrong. You didn't hear him wrong. You heard him clearly. The storm was always part of the package. But maybe the real question isn't whether your faith is strong enough. Maybe the real question is whether you'll do what Peter did. Stop trying to save yourself and simply cry out to the one who's already walking toward you on the water. He was headed to that boat before Peter ever asked to come. He's headed toward you right now, in the middle of whatever storm has your name on it. The 11 who stayed in the boat worshipped Jesus after he climbed in, and the wind died down. Peter worshipped him while the waves were still crashing, gripping the hand that pulled him from the deep. Two kinds of worship, one from safety, one from salvation. And the one forged in the water, soaking wet, gasping humbled, that worship carried a weight the dry kind never could. So get out of the boat. Step into the impossible thing God is asking of you. And when you start to sink, because you will, because Peter did, because faith that's never been tested is faith that's never been proven, open your mouth and say his name. 3 words are enough. He's already reaching.